Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bundesliga Show. And by popular demand, myself and Mark have got around finally to doing episode 7 of the Bundesliga Show Derby Day Dive-In. And, we've been kind of umming and ahhing about what derby we actually wanted to cover next. There's quite a lot, ones that we maybe haven't covered in the leagues below the Bundesliga, but one we're covering today is, as you can see on screen, the Franconian-Bavarian Derby, Bayern versus Nuremberg. So Mark gets to talk about his beloved again in a Derby Day special. We're going to go through, as we always do. So there are going to be 4 different categories that we go through in regards to this particular derby. One of which Mark will kick us off in a minute with some general history of why this is a derby, some of the politics around it as well. Then we'll kind of go into the balance of power, seeing over the years who's been getting the better of who. And then we'll talk about the trophy cabinets of both teams. And I'm sure a lot of you will probably be amazed to learn the vast trophy cabinet of Nuremberg as well. And then we'll go through some of the iconic matches between the two teams as well and finish up. So I hope you enjoy the show and get stuck into it. Just before we get going, please do make sure you drop us a like for this 7th edition of Derby Day Dive-Ins. Comment subsequently afterwards, see what you thought of the show. Make sure you press that red button to subscribe to the channel. Right then, Mark. So, huge derby this. So interesting to research. So, I'll hand over to you gladly to get us started with some general history of this, Franconian-Bavarian Derby, or also kind of known as just the Bavarian Derby as well.
Yeah, without doubt. Yeah, and definitely a derby that's one of the biggest ones in Germany as well. I think we were talking before the show, Rory, that actually a lot of people that probably started following the Bundesliga in the last 20 years didn't know just how big FC Nuremberg are, but they're definitely probably one of the top 7, 8 clubs in Germany, and probably Nuremberg fans would argue even higher than that in terms of the big clubs list. But yeah, a little bit about the history. Both clubs were founded around about the same time as well, in 1900, and immediately, obviously the initial derby was founded on distance. There are only 180 kilometers, which is round about 110, 120 miles for you mile measurers as well over there in the UK and US. So not that much different distance really, especially when you've got roads as good as here in Germany. So yeah, it was basically the 2 biggest cities in Bavaria as well. Remember, Munich has nowadays around about 1 million people, and Nuremberg around about half of that, around 500,000. So it is still a pretty big city. Both are big cities here in Germany. So yeah, initially it was founded basically on distance with the proximity of the 2 clubs. The 3 big clubs in Bavaria, which was initially Bayern Munich, FC Nuremberg, and Greuther Fürth, which we've already covered a little bit about the Nuremberg rivalry with them. They were the kind of 3 initial powerhouses of South Germany and also of Germany in general in the early 20th century, at the start of professional German football, really. Obviously, back then it was the South German Championship that they were mostly competing in, so there were a lot of regular meetings at that time as well. But yeah, there are also a lot of politics involved. Like, a lot of people know this is the Bavarian Derby, which technically it is. Like, both clubs are situated in the Bundesland of Bavaria, which is, but there is a lot of politics involved with this. Basically, Bavaria is divided into 2 parts. You've got traditional Bavaria, like Upper Bavaria, or Oberbayern as it's called in German, or Franconia in English, and Franken in German. So yeah, basically, like, Franken makes up North Bavaria, and like Oberbayern makes up South Bavaria, basically. And there's a lot of animosity between the 2 halves of Bavaria. A lot of that is to do with the history, because initially, basically, Bavaria incorporated Nuremberg and Franconia as part of Bavaria in 1806 it was a lot to do with Napoleon, actually, incredibly. Like, Napoleon had a lot of power in the region, and he basically united the 2 provinces of Franconia and Bavaria. And ever since then, for the last, 200 years or so, basically, a lot of Franconians consider Nuremberg to be its own state, basically, Franconia. So yeah, that's why a lot of people call it the Franken Bayern Derby, basically. Yeah. So yeah, let's see a little bit more. Also, the other kind of big point in terms of the politics of this derby is the fact that Nuremberg was founded as a workers' club as well. So Nuremberg is a kind of more working class area, although there are a lot of like more kind of upmarket areas in the town now as well. But initially, it was a working class town, and it was founded by the workers, like the working class. Whereas Bayern Munich was founded by a bunch of basically wealthy academics. So that was one of the kind of early jokes about the two clubs. And actually, Nuremberg fans in the early days called Bayern Munich the Cavaliers, because basically it's like a kind of joke that they were a bunch of like upper class, like noblemen, basically, who founded Bayern Munich. And I think Bayern fans also in the early days made jokes about Nuremberg just being like a working class kind of peasants club in a way almost. So there was that kind of banter in the early days as well. But then obviously, so that's a little bit about the background of the derby. And there's also a lot of information about the balance of power, because obviously in the early days, which I'll come on to Rory again in a minute about that, but it hasn't always been the one-sided derby that it is nowadays, had it, Rory, really?
Yeah, absolutely. The balance of power has really been quite even when you spread it over the course of time. The two sides have actually been playing against each other. As you mentioned, Mark, in the early in the early 20th century, Nuremberg and Greuther Fürth were like the teams to beat, really, weren't they? And so, like in the context of this derby, Nuremberg were well ahead. Kind of, I think in January 1925, Der Club, as Nuremberg are referred to or known as, had 17 club wins. Versus Bayern's 15 out of the 35 they'd played so far. So they were narrowly ahead in those early stages. But then as time would go on throughout the middle of the 20th century, they would go on to really hammer home their advantage, winning German titles, constantly finishing above Bayern in the league tables, what would have been at the time the Oberliga Sud. Their record after the Second World War had finished as well. Nuremberg still clearly ahead. At that point in time, they had 37 wins versus Bayern's 20. So you can see really they did start to stretch that advantage in terms of the derby as time went on. Again, at that point in time, they had 6 German championships and 2 cup victories versus Bayern's 1. So again, you can clearly see, and at that time, Nuremberg were, the record champions, and that was the case for a long old while, wasn't it, Mark? I mean, they got caught up eventually, but at one point the domination of Nuremberg was so clear that in April 1955, Nuremberg beat Bayern 6-1, and that also marked Bayern's first relegation to the second division.
Wow.
So this is before the Bundesliga was formed itself. Obviously Bayern would go into the second division before the Bundesliga was officially formed, of which obviously Nuremberg were original founders of, or founder members in the Bundesliga. And then Bayern would come into it, into the Bundesliga shortly afterwards. And that was obviously all that thing between Bayern and 1860 Munich, which is maybe a derby for another day that we can do. So really interesting between those two. But yeah, obviously after that, the balance of power was starting to shift a little bit, but again, it was still pretty even. It took until 1987 actually for Bayern to come to prominence and overtake Nuremberg, who had held the record of being German champions. What's the German phrase for that, Mark?
The Rekordmeister, yeah.
Meister, yeah, absolutely. So Nuremberg had been so for 64 years, but eventually Bayern would overtake them, and obviously go on to become far and away the Rekordmeisters. And so the last time that Nuremberg actually finished ahead of Bayern in terms of the Bundesliga table was the 91-92 season. So naturally now what we're looking 30 years on, that balance of power has swung the other way. Yeah, Bayern have completely, they've dominated the majority of the clashes since then. And obviously that's only been clashes in the Bundesliga. Nuremberg themselves, as Mark will be well aware, have been more of a yo-yo team. And those who have only really been watching the show with us since we started won't have seen Nuremberg as a Bundesliga team, which is so strange because of what big club Nuremberg are. And even myself doing this research, like, this is absolutely crazy. Like, Nuremberg are huge. So it is so strange. And hopefully we will get Nuremberg back in the Bundesliga very soon to reignite this fantastic derby. So, yeah, I mean, obviously Mark will talk about the vast trophy cabinets of both sides in a minute, and there's some really interesting, big matches that both teams have played in the cup and in the league against each other. And then just finishing off with a interesting statistic. So Bayern now overall have 90 victories versus 65 Nuremberg's, but Nuremberg still lead the overall goal difference between the two teams with 337 goals to Bayern's 323. So they're still ahead, and they will be for a while yet until they meet again. I think the last meeting between the two teams was actually a friendly, wasn't it, Mark?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Nuremberg won that 5-5.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, I think the whole city just went crazy when that happened. Yeah, it was just before COVID in 2020. Yeah, and I think it was like a tradition at that time that if they weren't playing in the same division, then Nuremberg would invite Bayern for a friendly. But I think that's actually gone by the wayside, unfortunately, the last few years. I don't know if it's for financial reasons, but that was a tradition. And basically, Nuremberg beat them 5-2, and nobody could believe it because Nuremberg were actually having a really poor season at that time as well. And that was one of the famous results. But they do count friendlies as well to the overall total. So and actually the last Bundesliga meeting was a 1-1 draw as well, which was a famous game because Nuremberg actually missed a penalty in the last minute in that as well. So I think Nuremberg were already relegated or very, very close to being relegated in 2019. And Bayern came, they were very close to being champions, and Nuremberg were winning for long periods. Bayern scored right near the end, but then Nuremberg famously had a penalty and they hit the post with it. I'll never forget that game. I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I was watching on TV and I couldn't believe the guy missed. Yeah, but that was Nuremberg at that time anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that should hopefully give you a bit of an understanding as to this is not just a Bayern since the dawn of time winning every match, because it's far from the case. And it's so interesting to look back at how prominent Nuremberg were. And as we say, we hope that will switch around in due course. But I'll hand back over to you, Mark, to talk about the respective trophy cabinets of both sides.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as Rory mentioned earlier, like, a lot of you might be surprised to know like just how many titles FC Nuremberg have won, because, definitely not since the 21st century started, but they've actually only won one cup since then, FC Nuremberg, which was actually, Rory, a famous 3-2 win over, you guessed it, VfB Stuttgart in 2007, which actually led to their only Europa League campaign of the 21st century, where they actually played the likes of Everton and Benfica as well, which was quite interesting. But yeah, that's kind of besides the point. But yeah, obviously in the early days of FC Nuremberg, they were just machines. They were title-winning machines, and they did, before the foundation or the formation of the Bundesliga in 1963, FC Nuremberg already had 8 national titles, and they actually added a 9th in 1969 when they actually won the one and only Bundesliga title. Obviously, the Bundesliga was officially founded in 1963. So yeah, they've only actually won one national title since then. Incredibly, for Bayern Munich, it was the opposite way. They'd only won one German championship before the foundation of the Bundesliga, which was in 1932, which was actually seen as a massive shock when Bayern Munich won it at that time, because they weren't really seen as a kind of powerhouse in Germany before the the foundation of the Bundesliga. But basically, as Rory mentioned, they didn't even play in the first season of the Bundesliga. They only joined in the second season. But since then, they've gone on to win 31 Bundesliga titles, which could possibly be 32 as of this season as well. But yeah, overall, they won 32 domestic titles to Nuremberg's 9. But as I think Rory mentioned earlier, until 1987, Nuremberg actually had more titles than Bayern, but now they trail by just the measly 23. But yeah, let's see. Who knows? Maybe in another 50 years, we could be talking about Nuremberg as the dominant force in this rivalry again. As for German Cups, yeah, again, Nuremberg were also the dominant force until the 80s, until Bayern again. Really, it was probably the 80s, really, when Bayern Munich really started to dominate German football, really, in many ways. You know, the 80s, 90s, and since then, you know, they've had complete dominance the last 10 years. Yeah. But yeah, actually, Bayern Munich have won 20 cups overall now, and obviously they're still in it this year as well. And Nuremberg just the 4 cups, which was most recently in, as I mentioned before, 2007 when they beat Stuttgart. But you never know, you know, we could see a cup win potentially in the next year or two. That anything's possible in German football, isn't it? Yeah, so that's a domestic, as you can see, 52 domestic titles, not including Super Cups for Bayern, and not too shabby 13 for Nuremberg, which is still one of the best. I still think now it's the 3rd best in Germany after Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund for overall titles in the Bundesrepublik. So not too shabby at all. Yeah, as for European action, Bayern Munich also dominates in this as well. I looked up, FC Nuremberg have never won a major European honour, but they have been to the quarterfinals of the European Cup twice in the 1960s, and also the semi-final of what is now the Europa League in the 70s as well. So, you know, not too shabby. There's a lot of clubs with worse European pedigree than that. As for FC Bayern Munich, they won 6 European Cups, obviously most recently in 2020 when they beat Paris Saint-Germain famously in front of no fans. And obviously won Europa League in 1996 as well. But to be honest, given Bayern Munich's credit, I'm not even sure they'll classify that as a trophy, really, because, you know, for them, it's all about Bundesligas and European Cups, really. And to a lesser extent, DFB Pokals as well. But as you can see, both clubs absolutely steeped in silverware. And yeah, over to Rory to talk to us about the iconic matches then.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a fair few of them in the time that Bayern and Nuremberg have been facing off against each other. So I'll just kind of take you through a couple of them. And a couple of them have had significant, impacts made by refereeing decisions. And I'm sure Mark will comment on them when I come to them because they're quite well known as well. But yeah, before I get onto those particular games, I think one to come to first of all will be a good one for Mark to refer to. Not that it was before our time. So in December of 1967, definitely one that will live long in the memory for Nuremberg fans. They beat Bayern 7-3 in a obviously high scoring, entertaining match where a Nuremberg striker named Franz Bruns managed to score 5 of the 7 goals. And at that point, it was a really important match because it spread the gap between Nuremberg and second placed Bayern, and obviously was one of their title winning seasons actually. So not only was it a massive occasion to win 7-3 against your dear rivals, 5 goals by your striker, but it was also really important from a title winning sense. So that absolutely was a big win there. Some other really winning matches. Then we can talk about the DFB Cup final here, Mark, in 1982. This is probably one of the ones that I was referring to. So Bayern were actually 2-0 down at half-time when they squared off in 1982, DFB Cup final. Obviously looking like Nuremberg would go away and take the win. However, there were goals from Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Wolfgang Kraus, Paul Breitner, and Dieter Hoeneß. But So Bayern would go on to win 4-2 from 2-0 down at halftime. Huge comeback. But there was, this was before the fact that Nuremberg missed a penalty, I believe, Mark, in the first half. So it should have been 3-0 up. And the fact that a referee made a very bad call with a penalty, which was, I think, awarded to Bayern in the end, which obviously tipped the scales massively and saw them go 3-2 ahead and eventually win 4-2 and winning the cup. Is that something you've heard of in folklore Nuremberg history?
Yeah, I think both games, absolutely. Yeah, the one you mentioned first is absolutely written in, I think, the most famous amongst Nuremberg fans, because actually that team that they had also included some of the greatest German players, well, like some Müller, Beckenbauer, Sepp Maier. That was one of the great, like the first great Bayern team, and for Nuremberg to beat them so well was a famous game. Yeah, there's actually footage of that game on YouTube. You've all got to check it out. Because, I mean, it looked amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as for the other game, the cup final, yeah, definitely Nuremberg fans remember that, unfortunately. Yeah. But a lot of Nuremberg fans actually say they've only got themselves to blame for missing the penalty, because if they were 3-0 up, that would have been a long way back. So, German fans do often kind of look at more with the kind of half full perspective. They don't like to dwell too much on decisions. And, if Nuremberg score that penalty, it'd probably be 5 cups for Nuremberg and 19 for Bayern. Let's be honest.
That's very true. Yeah, absolutely. Some other games that having looked and researched on, there was obviously the ghost goal game, wasn't there, Mark? So this is a really interesting one because there was a game played between the two teams in April 1994, and obviously it no longer. It finished 2-1 to Bayern in effect, but the game has been struck from the history books because Thomas Helmer scuffed a shot wide of the post, but the referee gave it as a goal. But Nuremberg obviously absolutely fuming with this, appealed the decision, and then the game was actually replayed 10 days later. But then Bayern would go on to win 5-0. So it was a pretty interesting and crazy 10 days, I guess. It would go on and help. It would also go on and help Bayern to win their 12th Bundesliga, and also it would help initially to relegate Nuremberg. So really, really crazy kind of spell of time there between the two teams, and significant on many ends. And then just 2 to finish on, because I just like the stories behind them. So Bayern edged out Nuremberg in the Pokal second round on a kind of penalty shootout. 18 penalty kicks were taken. Bayern would go through eventually. Obviously, tight game, very close between those two rivals. But Bayern would actually go on to lose in the quarterfinals of the Pokal at that point to Alemannia Aachen. I probably butchered that pronunciation. They're currently a team in the Regional Liga West, but they were a team at one point. At that time, they're a Zweite Bundesliga side, and they would go on to lose the final, Aachen, to Werder. So I just think that's quite a nice story. Yeah. So Bayern didn't actually go on to win the thing, but quite an interesting story in the background there. And then quite recently, another goal. I mean, this derby's got so many goals in it all the way through. I think it averages like well over 3 or something crazy like that. Bayern beat Nuremberg in 2005 6-3. Would help them to go on and win the league. Nuremberg would just about avoid relegation, but in the same season, Marek Mintal, who
legend.
I hope you know well of, would actually finish that season top goal scorer, despite the fact that Nuremberg came 14th. He was top goal scorer with 24 goals ahead, 2 goals ahead of Roy Mackay. So great names thrown out there, and the Slovakian striker, the top goal scorer, and that is pretty much us wrapped up in a nutshell with this rivalry, this derby. Been really interesting to kind of go through it and research on this. Learned so much myself, and I hope you all have too, and seen how close it actually is between these two teams and how big it is in Germany. So I think we shall end it there, Mark. So over to you to just close up the show.
Yeah, ironically about Mintal, I think Nuremberg fans, the folklore is that they've still not had a decent striker since Mintal, to be honest. Yeah, that's what a lot of Nuremberg fans say. But yeah, he is truly like a god amongst the Nuremberg fans. They still chant his name even now. He was that good. Like, I think he ended up getting a bad injury, unfortunately, which kind of curtailed his career a little bit early, but he was seen as a real top player. Yeah, and he was also part of the team that won the Pokal the year after that, actually, as well. But yeah, we digress. So yeah, if you enjoyed what we saw today, then check out at Over the Bar FB and at Over the Bar Extra. Also remember to follow our main site, which is otbfootball.net. And then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what you think about our derby. You know, are you more into FC Nuremberg, or are you more of a Bayern Munich guy or woman? So yeah, we hope you enjoyed what you saw today, and look out for more Derby Day dive-ins to come in the future. See you later, guys.